Next, joining me to discuss the film is its producer, director, and main subject, Myra Williams Ottewell. Welcome.
Thank you.
So first tell us how this film came about. You were a teacher in British Columbia. How did this film come about?
A friend who taught in the south end of Surrey told me that a colleague had shown the film Mississippi Burning to his class, and she suggested that I might want to speak with the students.
So Mississippi Burning was a film in the late 90s about the murder in Philadelphia, Mississippi of
the three civil rights workers. That's right. And it's a very powerful film. It's visceral. It really is very difficult to watch in many ways because of the violence. My colleague invited me to come. I spoke with the students. I told them that the facts of that case and of the film were true, and horrible things did happen to black people in Mississippi, but that was not my experience. And my telling my story seemed incredible to those students. They couldn't believe me.
Because what they saw in the film didn't mesh with what you described. Is that why, or
right.
did they think you were lying? Did they think that you were sheltered from reality as a child?
Yeah. At first, I thought about the disparity between what they had seen, so riveting and so powerful, and then my story of growing up and having a black nanny, and just the very ordinariness of it. The contrast is just stark.
Right. Because you were a child during the Mississippi Burning period, right?
No, I was. I graduated from high school in 1965.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
So I was in the middle of all of this, and I remember saying to my mother about our maid at that time, a lady who worked for us, "Is Mildred involved in this?" And she said, "I don't know." So my world with the black people that were in it was very cordial. There were no ill feelings. There was no argument. There was no hatred, certainly in my household. But I couldn't seem to get that across to those students.
I mean, did you get it, when you think back to your childhood growing up, did you get a sense that your maid felt the racial tension but didn't want to share it in your household?
That was not a sense that I had back then.
And she's passed it.
There was no, there was this easy intermixing with black people in my life, and there was no tension, and there was nothing was spoken of the turmoil of that day at all. And so not seeing it, I sometimes use the illustration, does a fish know it's wet? I mean, we were just immersed in a culture where everybody had their place. You know, a terribly offensive phrase.
What did you think that, if you couldn't go to the colored water fountain, did that register at all, or that was the way it was? And
it was not anything that I questioned. It was the way that life was. There were separate things, and that's the only time I remember when I went to that water fountain at the zoo, and I thought, oops, I'm at the wrong one, and I wondered, what would have happened to me? My friend wrote me, and she said, when I was at the zoo, I went over and drank from that water fountain, and it tastes just like ours. And so I guess they've got theirs, and we've got ours. Isn't that amazing?
And likewise, going on the bus just was accepted.
There were very few times when I rode the bus, but occasionally I would be late at school and would ride the bus home around 4:30, something like that, and the maids would be getting off work. As I rode home, I would get off and sit at the front, and there was a colored sign hanging there, and the maids would go to the back. But they were happy to see their friends, so they would see every day getting on the bus, and I, probably the only white person on there, enjoyed watching them enjoy each other. So there was a disconnect.
In this film, you explore your own family history, not only your own experiences, as we discussed, but your own family history. What did you learn?
I had no idea that our family, going back to my great-great-grandfather, was given land, the swamp land grant, that we were poor.
Back in 1850.
Back in the 1850s. And so that land was passed down through generations. But there were laws on the books that black people could not even own land. And so, for example, when the cotton crop came in and it plunged from 25 cents a pound to a nickel a pound, neither my great-grandparents or the cotton farmer, the sharecropper, got a dime. But my grandparents were able to hold on to that land, and the sharecropper had nothing.
Right. Back then in the 1850s, presumably, there was slavery, right? Did your great-great-grandfather own slaves?
Not that we're able to find out. We think that somewhere previous to that in Virginia, perhaps. We're not able to verify that, but we think there was a slave.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, even more contemporarily, your father, for instance, you talk about how your father I mean, did you think of your father as someone who was prejudiced when you were growing up? Do you think of him now as someone who was prejudiced?
Well, we conveniently separated things back in those days. We thought of racism or prejudice as personal wrongdoing in your interactions. If you were ugly and mean to somebody, that was racist or being prejudiced. But the things that I saw in everyday life with my neighbors and with my family were good interpersonal relationships. But I was completely blind to the system of separated schools, water fountains,
or even
all of
neighborhoods
that kind of
trying to keep. I mean,
yeah.
didn't you even talk about how your father sort of tried to keep blacks out of the neighborhood?
Yeah, just recently my neighbors got back together again since from the 60s. We hadn't seen each other. And so I found out it was my dad's idea. It was not really an idea man, but I can just imagine worrying about property values. And this is typically what happened. Black people moved into the neighborhood, property values plunged.
Right.
And so there's a self-fulfilling kind of prejudicial kind of thing as well. And so, yeah, my dad and my neighbors wanted to help a white family out so that we could get white neighbors instead of black neighbors.
Now, the film aired on Mississippi Public Broadcasting on February 11th. What was the reaction in your home state?
To my contemporaries, white contemporaries, that so many of them said that was my story too. And it seemed like a cathartic experience for them to actually revisit those days and to think back and reflect on them. And so many of them, as I started this project, said, I can't believe we were like that. So it was very interesting.
Was there a story in that they've sort of also kind of rediscovered what it was really like? Have a lot of them been reflecting back on it?
Yes, and I think also the book, The Help, which has come out recently, has also sparked a lot of that retrospective thinking as well.
What about amongst black communities? Have you heard any reaction?
Well, I've had a mixture of reactions, and at the screening that we had just before the broadcast, it was the first time for me to come in contact with, I would call, and some of them would call, black radical part of that segment of that population. And they didn't think I went far enough. They thought I set the bar too low. They thought that Dolphus Weary was setting the bar too low in terms of race relations and interacting with the other. But most black Americans, most black Mississippians rather, were very pleased to have that part of their story acknowledged because they had not heard a white person acknowledge what happened to them.
Well, I'm sure you've heard this. I've heard it plenty in the South amongst whites who say, let's move forward, not backward. We acknowledge this is a bad time, bad period of time, but why should we dwell on it? It's only going to make things worse. You know, blacks and whites are getting along pretty well. Why stir things up? What do you say to people who make that argument?
I quote Donna Ladd, who's in the documentary, who says that's the Mississippi riddle. We have to look backward to look forward. We have to have our young people understand the context, the reason why things were the way they were in order to move forward. And I think a lot of Mississippians are saying, a lot of white Mississippians are saying, you know, we solved that problem, let's move on. But there's just a gap in our understanding of why things were the way they were.
You played a clip in the film of one of Martin Luther King's many famous speeches, this one in a speech he gave in Mississippi, talking about this sort of idealistic goal of his, of blacks and whites living together in the future. Are we there? How far away are we? Is that achievable? Is Martin Luther King's goal actually attainable?
I don't know. And this film brought up so many things that I want to know more about. So I think the inspiration is there to continue on, but we're a long way from it yet.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Good luck with the film. You can find out more about Myra's film at MississippiRemixed.com. More of The Standard in a moment.